Before I tell you about the 8 rules that kept me breathing for 4 years as a night security guard at the Tower of London, you need to understand something crucial. The tourists who visit during the day, they see the crown jewels, hear stories about Anne Boleyn, and take selfies with the beefeaters. They think they know the tower, but they don't know anything. What I'm about to tell you isn't in any guidebook. It's not part of any official Yeoman Warder tours. It's not mentioned in any historical documentary or royal website. This is the real Tower of London, the one that wakes up after the last tourist leaves and the gates are locked for the night. My name is James Fletcher, and I've been a night security guard at HM Tower of London for 4 years. The tower isn't a tourist attraction or a museum. It's not just where they keep the crown jewels or where Anne Boleyn lost her head. It's a prison, and some of the inmates never left. What I'm about to tell you might sound absolutely mental, but I swear on my mother's grave, every word is true. Because when you work the night shift at a place where over 1,000 people have been executed, where torture was an art form, and where 900 years of human suffering have soaked into every stone, you learn that the history doesn't stay buried, it comes looking for you. Getting a job at the tower isn't like applying to work at Tesco or a call centre, background checks that go back 3 generations, security clearance that makes MI5 look casual, psychological evaluations, polygraph tests, and interviews with people who never give you their real names. They told me it was because of the crown jewels, over £20 billion worth of royal regalia sitting in the jewel house, but I learned later it was for entirely different reasons. The Tower of London isn't just Britain's most secure fortress, it's Britain's most haunted workplace, and they need guards who can handle what walks the battlements after midnight. On my first day, Chief Security Officer Margaret Hayes gave me the standing briefing: patrol routes, radio protocols, emergency procedures. All was very professional, very by the book. Then, just as I was about to leave her office, she handed me a sealed brown envelope. "Don't open this until after your first week," she said, her face deadly serious. "If you last that long, you'll understand why you need it." "What's in it?" I asked. Margaret's expression didn't change. "Instructions for survival." I thought she was having me on, some sort of initiation joke for the new lad. The Tower of London, after all, is just a building. Old, sure. Historic, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's stone and mortar, tourists and gift shops. During the day, that's exactly what it is, but the tower at night is something else entirely. My first week was educational. The building makes noises. Old buildings do that. Creaking timbers, settling stones, pipes that groan in the walls like animals in pain. Wind through the arrow slits sounds like whispers. The Thames lapping against the river wall creates rhythms that almost sound like footsteps. Almost. But there were other sounds. Sounds that didn't have explanations. Singing from the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula when nobody was inside. Laughter echoing from the bloody tower's upper floors. The sound of chains dragging across cobblestones in areas where there were no chains. And the feeling, God, the feeling, like being watched by 1,000 eyes, like standing in a room full of people who were holding their breath, waiting for something. By day 7, I was ready to hand in my notice. The job paid well, very well, but no amount of money was worth the constant sense of dread that settled on my shoulders the moment the sun went down. That's when I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten list, copied and recopied so many times the paper was soft with air. At the top, in faded ink, Rules for Night Security, Tower of London, established 1953, updated as necessary. Rule 1. Never patrol the bloody tower alone between 2 AM and 3 AM. Rule 2. If you see Anne Boleyn walking towards the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, do not follow. Rule 3. The ravens must never be disturbed after midnight. They are not just birds. Rule 4. If all 6 ravens gather in one place and stare at you, back away slowly and call for backup. Rule 5. The Wakefield Tower door must remain locked. If you find it open, lock it immediately and leave. Rule 6. Never count the prisoners in the Salt Tower. There should be none, but sometimes there are. Rule 7. If you hear singing from the White Tower after midnight, it's not a recording. Rule 8. The Traitor's Gate is off limit during the witching hour, 3 AM to 4 AM. At the bottom, in different handwriting, these rules were written by guards who didn't make it through their shifts. Each rule represents someone who learned the hard way. Follow them or join them. I stared at the paper for 10 minutes, reading and rereading. This had to be our wind-up. Margaret Hayes seemed like the type who enjoyed scaring new employees. But then I remembered the sounds, the feelings, the way shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. And I decided that maybe, just maybe, it was better to follow the rules than to find out what happened if you didn't. My second week started normally enough. I'd memorized the rules, though I still thought they were elaborate nonsense. The tower during my shift was quiet, peaceful even. Just me, the ravens, and 900 years of history. It was a Tuesday night, 2:30 in the morning, when I learned that the rules weren't just suggestions. I was doing my standard patrol route, which included a circuit of Tower Green, the execution site where Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Lady Jane Grey had met their ends. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the green, turning the ancient execution site into a checkerboard of light and darkness. As I approached the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, I saw her, a woman in a Tudor dress, walking slowly towards the chapel entrance. She was perhaps 30 meters away, moving with that peculiar gliding motion that you sometimes see in old films, as if the ground beneath her feet was perfectly smooth. Even from a distance, I could see she was carrying something. It took my brain several seconds to process what it was. Her own head. Anne Boleyn making her nightly journey to her burial place more than 480 years after her execution. Rule 2 flashed through my mind. If you see Anne Boleyn walking towards the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, do not follow. But I'm human, and humans are curious creatures. Every instinct told me to investigate, to get closer, to solve the mystery my eyes were presenting. I found myself taking a step towards her, then another. She was wearing a green gown, the same colour she wore to her execution in 1536. Her dark hair was long and flowing, covering her shoulders. The head in her hands was turned towards the chapel, but I could see her lips moving, as if she was praying or perhaps rehearsing her final words. I took another step. That's when she stopped. Still facing the chapel, she slowly turned the head in her hands to look at me. Even in the moonlight, across 30 meters of open ground, I could see her eyes, dark, intelligent, and infinitely sad. Her lips moved again, but this time I could hear the words, carried on a wind that shouldn't have existed in the still night air. "Another guard," she said. Her voice sounded like autumn leaves rustling. "They send so many young men to watch over my grave. Do you know why they're afraid of me?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. My throat had closed up, my tongue felt like lead. She began to turn her body to face me fully, still holding her head at arm's length. As she moved, the temperature around me dropped, my breath came out in white puffs, and frost began forming on the grass beneath my feet. "I want to show you something," Anne Boleyn said. Her voice was now coming from both the head in her hands and her headless body. "I want to show you what they did to me, what they did to all of us." That's when training kicked in. Not security training, survival training. The kind that tells you when you're in mortal danger and you need to move immediately. I turned and walked away. Not ran, walked. Something told me that running would be worse, would trigger some predatory instinct that I didn't want to discover. Behind me, I heard singing. A beautiful, haunting melody in a language I didn't recognize. Possibly Latin, possibly something older. The song seemed to come from everywhere at once. The chapel, the execution site, the very stones beneath my feet. When I looked back, she was gone. I spent the rest of my shift in the security office, drinking tea and pretending to do paperwork. My hands didn't stop shaking until sunrise. The next morning, I cornered Margaret Hayes. "I saw her," I said without preamble. Margaret didn't ask who, she just nodded. "Anne's been making that walk twice a week for nearly 5 centuries. Some guards tried to follow her into the chapel. What happened to them?" Margaret's expression grew dark. "They quit, all of them, usually the next day. One lad lasted 3 days before he checked himself into a hospital. Complete nervous breakdown. Said he couldn't sleep anymore, that he heard her singing in his dreams, that she showed him the true history of the tower. The true history. Not the sanitized version they tell tourists, the real history. The screaming, the torture, the desperation of people who knew they were going to die slowly and painfully. Anne experienced every execution that happened after her own. She's been collecting them, storing them, for centuries. Why didn't you warn me specifically about her?" Margaret poured herself tea from a thermos. "Would you have believed me, or would you have thought I was mental and quit on the spot?" She had a point. Sometimes you have to see the impossible to understand that the rules aren't just workplace guidelines, they're survival instructions. Over the next few months, I learned that each rule had been written for a very specific, very dangerous reason. The Tower of London isn't just a historical site, it's a collection point for human suffering on an industrial scale. 900 years of executions, torture, imprisonment, and death have created something unique in the world. A place where the past refuses to stay buried. Rule 3 became clear during my 6th week. Everyone knows the legend of the Tower Ravens. If they ever leave the tower, the kingdom will fall. Charles II made it official law in 1661. What they don't tell the tourists is that the ravens you see during the day are just the tip of the iceberg. The real ravens come out after midnight. I was doing my 1 AM patrol when I noticed all 6 ravens gathered in the middle of the Tower Green. Not roosting on their usual perches, not sleeping, standing in a perfect circle, all facing inwards towards something I couldn't see. As I approached, they turned to look at me all at once. 6 heads moving in perfect synchronization, like they were controlled by a single mind. Their eyes reflected the security lights, but the reflection was wrong. Too bright, too intelligent, too human. Rule 4. If all 6 ravens gather in one place and stare at you, back away slowly and call for backup. I followed the rule, maintaining eye contact while slowly backing away. The ravens watched me go, their heads turning in perfect unison to track my movement. Only when I was well clear of the tower green did they break formation. When backup arrived 10 minutes later, the ravens were sleeping peacefully in their usual spots, as if nothing happened. "They're just birds," explained Tom Morrison, my backup that night. Tom had been working tower security for 15 years. "The original ravens were here before the tower was built, before the Normans, before the Saxons, before the Romans. They're guardians of something much older than William the Conqueror's fortress." "Guardians of what?" "The boundary," Tom said simply. "Between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The tower was built on a thin place where that boundary is weak. The ravens make sure things don't cross over that shouldn't." "And when they gather like that?" "Something's trying to cross, something big, usually happens before." Tom trailed off. "Before what?" "Before we lose a guard." That conversation should have been my cue to quit. Instead, it made me more curious. I started researching the tower's history during my days off, digging through archives at the British Library, reading accounts that never made it into the official histories. What I found painted a picture of the tower that no tourist guidebook would ever include. The Tower of London has been many things over its 900-year history. Royal palace, fortress, prison, mint, armoury, zoo, but primarily, it's been a place where people died badly. The official records list 112 executions within the tower walls. The unofficial records suggest the number is closer to 1,000. Executions, yes, but also torture victims who died in the dungeons, prisoners who starved to death in cells, guards who simply vanished during night shifts. Rule 5 nearly cost me my sanity during my 3rd month. The Wakefield Tower houses an exhibit about medieval torture devices. During the day, it's educational, slightly disturbing perhaps, but historical. At night, with the door that should remain locked standing wide open, it becomes something else entirely. I found the door open during my 2 AM patrol. Standard procedure would be to investigate, secure the area, file a report. But Rule 5 was explicit. Lock it immediately and leave. I should have followed the rule. Instead, I stepped in to check for intruders. The exhibit looked exactly how it should. Mannequins demonstrating the rack, the scavenger's daughter, the Iron Maiden, information plaques explaining medieval justice, normal museum stuff, except the mannequins were breathing. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching the chest of a wax figure rise and fall in slow, laboured breaths. Its eyes, which should have been lifeless glass, tracked my movement across the room. Then it spoke. "Help me," it whispered, its voice the sound of air escaping from old leather. "Please, it's been so long. Help me." The other mannequins began to stir, turning their heads, opening their mouths, reaching out with arms that should have been static displays. "We're still here," another voice said. "Still trapped, still in pain. The torture never ended. It just changed." I was out of that tower in seconds, slamming the door behind me and turning the lock with shaking hands. But as I walked away, I could hear them through the thick stone walls, whimpering, pleading, begging for help that would never come. The next morning, Margaret reviewed the security footage. 18 minutes, she said grimly. "You were in there for 18 minutes. It felt like maybe 2 minutes tops." Time works differently in the Wakefield Tower after midnight. The longest anyone's ever been trapped in there was 4 hours. Felt like 20 minutes to him. When we found him in the next morning, his hair gone completely white and he couldn't remember his own name. Trapped. The door locks from the outside, always has. Sometimes people go in and the door closes behind them. We find them eventually, but by then, Margaret shuddered, the torture never really stopped in that tower. It just became psychological instead of physical. Winter at the tower is different. Tourists thin out, the days grow short, and the nights become longer, darker, more conducive to things that shouldn't exist. It was during my first winter that I encountered Rules 6 and 7, and I learned that the tower's supernatural residents become more active when the veil between worlds grow thin. Rule 6 concerned the Salt Tower, one of the smaller towers that houses an exhibit about prisoners held in the tower throughout history. During the day, it's a sober reminder of political imprisonment and religious persecution. At night, especially in winter, it becomes something much more dangerous. The rule stated, never count the prisoners in the Salt Tower. There should be none, but sometimes there are. It was late November, around 3 AM, when I made my patrol through the Salt Tower. The exhibit consists of several cells, each set up to represent different historical periods. Mannequins in period dress, information plaques, recreated living conditions, standard museum fare. But as I walked through the tower, I started noticing discrepancies. In the Tudor cell, there were supposed to be 2 mannequins, a Catholic priest and a Protestant minister, representing the religious prisoners held during various reigns. There were 3 figures in the cell. The third was sitting in the corner, wearing clothes that didn't match any historical period represented in the exhibit. Modern clothes, a security guard's uniform in fact. I recognised the uniform, it was identical to mine. The figure looked up as I approached the cell. It was a man, perhaps 40 years old, with hollow eyes and skin that seemed translucent in the dim lighting. "Don't count us," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. "That's the rule, isn't it? Don't count the prisoners." I backed away from the cell, my heart hammering against my ribs. But the figure continued talking. "I used to work here, night security, like you. I followed most of the rules, but not that one. I counted. Do you know what happens when you count us?" I didn't answer. I was already moving towards the tower exit. "You become part of the count," he called after me. "You join the exhibit permanently." I made it out of the Salt Tower without looking back, but I could hear voices behind me, multiple voices, all calling the same thing. "Don't count us! Don't count us! Don't count us!" Rule 7 manifested 2 weeks later. The White Tower is the oldest part of the fortress, built by William the Conqueror in 1078. It houses the royal armories and the several historical exhibits. During the day, it's the tower's main tourist attraction. At night, according to Rule 7, if you hear singing from the White Tower after midnight, it's not a recording. I was crossing the inner ward around 2:30 AM when I heard it. A choir, singing what sounded like medieval hymns, beautiful, haunting melodies that seemed to come from the very stones of the White Tower. My first thought was that someone had left audio equipment running. Ghost tours sometimes use recorded sound effects to enhance the atmosphere. But as I got closer to the White Tower, I realised this wasn't recorded music. The voices were too clear, too varied, too human. And they were singing in languages that predated any recording technology. Latin, certainly, but also sounded like Old English, Norman French, and dialects I couldn't identify. The singing was coming from the chapel on the first floor, St. John's Chapel, and considered one of the finest examples of Norman architecture in London. I climbed the stone stairs to investigate, even though Rule 7 specifically warned against it. The chapel was empty of living people, but it was full of voices. As I stood in the doorway, I could see them. Transparent figures filling the chapel pews, all singing in perfect harmony. Knights in chainmail, priests in medieval robes, courtiers in Tudor dress, prisoners in rags, centuries of people who had worshipped in this chapel, all singing together in congregation that spanned 900 years. They weren't looking at me, they were focused on something at the altar, something I couldn't see, but their voices created harmonies that no earthly choir could achieve, melodies that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the most beautiful and terrifying music I've ever heard. When the singing finally stopped, the chapel was empty again, just stone and silence and the weight of history. But as I turned to leave, I heard a single voice behind me, a young voice, a child's voice. "Uncle promised we could go home," it said. "When will Mother come for us?" The prince is in the tower, still waiting for rescue that would never come. The worst night, the night that nearly broke me, the night that taught me why the rules exist and what happens when they all fail at once, came in February, almost exactly a year after I started working at the tower. It was Guy Fawkes night, November the 5th. London was full of fireworks and celebrations, but inside the tower walls, something else was building. All week, I'd noticed the rules being tested. Anne Boleyn had appeared 3 nights running instead of her usual twice weekly. The ravens gathered repeatedly, sometimes multiple times per shift. Doors that should have been locked were found open, and prisoners appeared in empty cells. It was as if the tower itself was restless, as if the anniversaries of rebellion and attempted renascence were stirring something deep in the fortress's foundations. My shift started at 10 PM, same as always, but from the moment I walked through the middle tower gate, I knew this night would be different. The air felt electric, charged with possibility and menace. The ravens were agitated, pacing their perches and clawing incessantly. Even the Thames seemed rougher than usual, waves slapping against the tower's wharf with unusual violence. By midnight, everything started going wrong at once. The first sign was the ravens. All 6 of them were gathered in the centre of Tower Green, but instead of their usual perfect circle, they formed a straight line, all facing the same direction, all staring at the bloody tower. Rule 4 said to back away slowly when the ravens gathered and stared, but they weren't staring at me. They were staring at something else, something I couldn't see. That's when I heard the children, voices echoing from the bloody tower's upper floors, clear as day in the still night air. "Uncle Richard promised we could go home. When will Mother come for us? Why won't anyone let us leave? We've been good boys, haven't we?" The princes in the tower, Edwin V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, murdered in 1483 on the orders of their uncle, Richard III. Still trapped in the tower where they died, still awaiting for answers that would never come. Rule 1 stated clearly, never patrol the bloody tower alone between 2 AM and 3 AM. It was only 12:30 AM and I wasn't alone. My partner Dave was working the south side of the fortress. But the children's voices were so clear, so desperate, that every human instinct told me to investigate. I called Dave on the radio. No response. I tried Margaret's emergency line. Dead air. The children kept calling, their voices becoming more distressed. Please, someone help us. We don't understand what's happening. Why is everyone ignoring us? I approached the bloody tower. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in white clouds and frost began forming on the stone walls. The voices were coming from the second floor, the room where the princes had been held before their disappearance. I climbed the narrow spiral staircase, each step taking me deeper into the tower's darkest history. On the second floor, I found them. 2 boys, perhaps 10 and 12 years old, dressed in medieval nightgowns. They were playing with wooden toys by candlelight, but the candles cast no shadows and gave off no heat. They looked up as I entered, their faces lighting up with hope. Are you here to take us home? The youngest one asked. Our uncle said we could go home soon, added the elder. We've been waiting so long. They looked so real, so alive, so innocent. It was impossible to remember that these children had been dead for over 500 years. I'm sorry, I said, not knowing what else to say. I can't take you home. The hope in their faces flickered and died. The temperature in the room dropped further. No one ever takes us home, the younger prince said, his voice becoming hollow, echoing. No one ever keeps their promises. The room began to change around us. The medieval furnishing became more solid, more real. The modern safety features, glass barriers, information plaques, fire exits faded away. I was no longer in a museum exhibit. I was in the actual room where the princes had been murdered. Everyone lies to us, the elder prince said, his face becoming gaunt, his eyes sinking into dark hollows. Everyone abandons us. Their toys crumbled to dust in their hands. Their nightgowns became stained with blood that hadn't been there moments before. But you're here now, they said in unison, their voices no longer childlike but ancient, hungry. You can stay with us forever. You can be our new uncle. The walls of the room began to close in. The candles flickered and went out, but somehow I could still see everything with perfect clarity. The princes were standing now, reaching towards me with hands that ended in fingernails grown so long and sharp from centuries of scratching at stone walls. Play with us, they said. Stay with us. Don't leave us alone again. That's when I heard the singing. Anne Boleyn's voice echoing through the tower, singing the same Latin hymn I heard her sing on that first night. But now she wasn't alone. Other voices joined her, hundreds of them, thousands of them. Every person who had ever died in the tower, all singing together in a chorus of the dead. The princes stopped advancing. They turned towards the sound, confusion replacing hunger in their ancient eyes. She's calling, the younger prince said. The queen is calling everyone home. The room shimmered, reality reasserting itself. The medieval furnishings faded, replaced by modern museum displays. The princes became translucent, their forms wavering like heat mirages. Next time, the elder prince said, his voice already fading. Next time, perhaps you'll stay. They vanished as the clock tower chimed 1 a.m. But the singing continued, growing louder, more insistent. Not just from the chapel now, but from every building in the tower complex. Voices from every era, every execution, every death, all singing the same haunting melody. I stumbled out of the bloody tower to find the entire fortress transformed. The courtyard was filled with figures, transparent, glowing, undeniably there. Prisoners in chains, guards in armour, priests in robes, nobles in finery, centuries of tower residents, all walking towards the chapel in a ghostly procession. And leading them all was Anne Boleyn, her head restored to her shoulders, wearing her execution dress, singing in a voice that carried the weight of 500 years of injustice. As the procession passed me, some of the figures turned to look. I saw faces I recognised from paintings, from history books, from the tower's official records. Guy Fawkes himself, his face bearing the marks of torture. The Duke of Monmouth, still handsome despite his violent end. Lady Jane Grey, so young, so tragically noble. They all nodded to me as they passed, acknowledging my presence but not inviting me to join their eternal parade. The procession entered the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, and the singing reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the tower. Then, suddenly, silence. The courtyard was empty, the fortress was still. Only the ravens remained, having returned to their usual perches as if nothing had happened. I found Dave unconscious in the security office, his radio smashed, his hair turned completely white. He recovered after 3 days, but couldn't remember anything about that night. He quit the following week. Margaret found me sitting on a bench in Tower Green at sunrise, staring at the chapel where I'd just witnessed the impossible. "Bad night?" she asked, settling beside me with 2 cups of tea from her thermos. "All of them," I said. "I saw all of them. Every ghost, every spirit, everyone who ever died here. They were singing together." Margaret nodded. "November the 5th is always difficult. Something about the anniversary of rebellions, of things being overthrown. The tower remembers." "How do you deal with it? How does anyone deal with working here?" "The rules," she said simply. "They're not just guidelines, James. They're a peace treaty, an agreement between the living and the dead about how we can coexist in the same place." She handed me the tea. It was strong, sweet, perfectly British, normal, human. "The Tower of London has stood for nearly 1,000 years, Margaret continued. "It's seen more death, more suffering, more concentrated human emotion than almost any building on Earth. That kind of history doesn't just disappear when the tourists go home. So why do we stay? Why do this job knowing what we know?" Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile I've seen from her in a year of working together. "Because someone has to bear witness, someone has to remember, and someone has to make sure the boundary between their world and ours stays intact. The boundary. Think about it. If the dead here were truly malevolent, if they wanted to harm the living, what could stop them? There are thousands of them, and only a handful of us. But they follow the rules too. They stay in their designated areas, appear at specified times, interact within certain perimeters. Why? Because we acknowledge them, we respect them, we remember their stories. In exchange, they don't cross over completely in our world." That conversation changed how I understood my job. I wasn't just a security guard protecting tourist attractions and the royal jewels. I was a negotiator, a diplomat, a keeper of the peace between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The tower chooses its guards carefully. Not everyone can handle the weight of so much history, so much concentrated tragedy. But for those of us who can, it becomes more than a job. It becomes a calling. I still work at the Tower of London, 4 years later. I've seen things that would make most people check themselves into hospital. I've spoken with Anne Boleyn, played with the princes in the tower, heard the confessions of traitors and the prayers of the martyrs. But I follow the rules, all 8 of them, religiously, without exception. Because the rules aren't just about avoiding ghosts or supernatural encounters, they're about maintaining a delicate balance between past and present, between justice and vengeance, between memory and madness. The Tower of London is many things: tourist attraction, royal fortress, repository of crown jewels, symbol of British power. But primarily, it's a bridge between worlds, a place where the past refuses to stay buried, where history lives and breathes and walks the battlements every night. If you ever visit the Tower of London during the day, remember what I told you. What you see in the sunshine, surrounded by tourists and beefeater guides, is just the surface. The real tower, the one that remembers everything, only wakes up after dark. The ravens know, they've always known. They're not just birds, they're not just there for tradition. They're sentries, standing guard over secrets that would drive most people mad. And now you know too. So if you're ever walking along the Thames late at night and you hear singing come from the direction of the tower, remember the rules. Remember that some places hold on to their history so tightly that the past becomes present, that the dead walk among the living, that 900 years of human emotion doesn't just disappear. It waits, it watches, it remembers, and it's always looking for new guards to help keep the peace. The tower needs people who understand that the past isn't the past, that history isn't just something that happened to other people in other times. History is alive, and it's working the night shift at the Tower of London. Sweet dreams, and mind the ravens.